So we can go ahead and get started. Just want to say thanks again for joining us in what is, I think, the third installment in a monthly webinar series that we're hosting around the issues and challenges that a lot of HR and talent acquisition professionals face in hiring and retaining talented employees. So our topic for today is using culture fit for hiring purposes. So how do we identify candidates that are aligned to specific roles and the cultural values that are kind of omnipresent within an organization? And so have a lot to cover today. At one point, we had this chopped up into two different sections, and we decided to winnow it down to one. So I know we've got 45 minutes together, and we'll certainly be respectful of everyone's time. So we will have a Q&A section at the end as well. If you have questions and want to drop them into the chat, feel free to do that throughout, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end. We'll also be offering up the opportunity to have a sales-free conversation with our I-O team. If you're interested in talking about kind of your plight in implementing culture in some of your talent management and hiring practices, and you want to chat with someone who's kind of experienced it, would love to put you on with one of our I-O folks and have that conversation. So be sure to look out for that at the end of the presentation. We'll have a QR code up that you can scan and book straight on someone's calendar. So just again, thank you so much for joining. We'll dive right in. So our agenda for today is Sarah is going to queue up some of the conversation around what we consistently hear from our clients around the challenges of using culture as part of their hiring process, and some of the benefits and advantages to doing that and doing it effectively. And so I'll let Sarah introduce herself. My name is Craig Ellis. I lead the I-O Psychology team at Match. And so you're going to hear from me a lot, but I'm going to take a short hiatus while Sarah introduces the topic for us. So Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys again for joining. As Craig said, my name's Sarah. I lead our sales and success teams here at Match. And what that really means in regards to this is I hear both the front end of the sales conversations in terms of the frustrations that our prospective clients are having, a lot of what's top of mind for those HR professionals, really what's going on in the business. And then certainly as those that have decided to partner with us go through implementation, we dive deeper into the roles that they have, their organization. And really over the past, I don't know, Craig, I would say realistically, like 2 to 3 years, culture has been at the top of a large majority of our conversations. And so we're excited to be able to share, kind of what we're hearing and how we can help you and what we know. But just to kind of kick off, when you think about culture, a lot of what we hear is HR teams are getting these projects or this overarching goal of please go out and make sure that the hires that you make are really fitting with our culture, right? And while that sounds like an incredible goal and something that, yes, we obviously want candidates and employees that align with our culture, it's hard to do that really effectively. And it's really hard to do it methodically, right? We hear a lot about how culture fit is often a feeling, right? It might be the canoe test or this gut reaction that you have when you're connecting with candidates. However, a much more effective way to go about that, right? And what we're really looking to accomplish is an actionable and a really tangible framework that you can work within when you're looking to say, is this person a good fit for our culture or not? And so what we want to talk with you about today is really how do you start to define what that culture is? What are the benefits of going through that process? Because sometimes it does take some work. And then what impacts you guys can expect to see when you've really aligned that culture effectively. Everyone loves a good ROI case or a good business case. So we always like to start with some really good numbers, and what we're finding in the research that we've done and companies that we've partnered with is hiring for culture and really making sure that that's at the core of your hiring. And certainly your business really pays dividends, and it can be in the your customers being more loyal, right? Because they can feel the culture, they know what it's like. We often we talk about a couple examples here that I'll get into, but it's one of those things when you are on the phone with a company, or you walk into, the brick and mortar of a company, and even if you're blindfolded and you could only really hear and smell, where you are and what the culture's like, and that's really critical to get right. A couple other things that we highlight here, certainly we've got individuals that are better performers when they feel like there's a strong sense of team and a strong sense of culture. And then we also know that, you're going to see individuals leaving earlier if they feel like that there's just a misalignment, right? They know that they're well poised to perform in one type of culture and yours is different. And so we've got employees that are leaving stating that exact reason. And that's something we can help you to avoid. So when you think about, understanding your culture, I think if everyone takes a moment to pause, and, when you think of your company culture, think about how you define that, right? What would you use to describe it? We find that often it's a lot of our clients or our prospective clients that are going to start stating their values. And values are certainly important, but what we really find is it's the behaviors that you see in your employees that are really defining the culture, right? Your employees are the front line of your business. They're the ones that are engaging with your customers. And so how they act and how they behave is how these customers are going to perceive your culture. And so what we really want to start to get right is how do you really find this balance between how your employees are behaving and your stated values, right? And how do we bring those together so that you've got a really strong culture and one that is defined really well so that you can do better hiring for it with a framework like what we're going to talk about today. So for example, and we talk about this a handful of times, but when you think about how that plays out, how that culture plays out and the employees' behaviors, like what we're talking about. You're looking at two massive logos here, right? Walmart and Publix. Everybody is familiar with them. They are wildly successful businesses. And at their core, they are consumer goods, right? You look at these values and there's a lot of similarity here in terms of what they've stated. But I think everyone would agree that the feeling or the culture that you perceive when you walk into Walmart is very different than the culture that you might get or see in Publix. And that is just kind of a great example of what we're talking about when we say you can say customer service, right? You can say respect for the individual, those are represented in both. But it's really about how that behavior is manifesting in your employees. And so how do you take these values that you've spent time defining really well and start to build a framework in terms of how do you want those values to play out in the customer interactions that your employees are having? And I know that's a ton here to talk about in terms of setup, but I think that really helps us to think through why it's important to really focus on those behaviors. It's really how they manifest, how they play out, and getting that right and making sure that you're identifying those right people is what drives, your brand, the culture that we recognize, and just productivity across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll jump in here, and thank you so much, Sarah. And so, kind of the playbook for the rest of our time together today is we're going to lay out a framework that you can use to take this idea of culture and boil it down to something that is actionable and tangible and can be implemented and utilized as part of your hiring and talent management practices, right? And so, we're going to start with how do you identify what your culture actually is? Like there are folks, I'm sure, on this call who are saying, yes, our executives and our leaders talk about our culture, and they talk about it as though it's crystal clear and it's obvious, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to define and articulate, and then implement as part of those talent management, selection, HR processes. So how do we identify what our culture is? How do we drill down and understand what are the key behaviors and work styles and approaches of those who are a good fit for our culture and those who are a bad fit for our culture? I'm going to use a word that our marketing folks are probably going to roll their eyes at, but we want to behavioralize your culture, right? Whenever we say we are collaborative or we're entrepreneurial or, we're energetic, great, let's define that. But what does that mean? What do we look for from people in order to find people who are collaborative or enthusiastic or energetic, right? And so we have to boil it down to behaviors. And then how do we ensure that those cultural characteristics and values that we've defined and articulated and isolated are actually accurate and can be used to make hiring and talent management decisions? So this is the framework that we're going to work through. We're going to start with, how do you define and articulate what your culture actually is? And so, like Sarah mentioned earlier, I'm sure whenever we say, hey, describe your culture, you could probably do it, right? You could give us some anecdotes or some historical narratives around, well, people, our customers would say we are this way. Or whenever we're hiring people and they ask that question, because candidates always ask that question, describe your culture, we have some boilerplate language that we can say to help articulate what our culture is. But ultimately, if we're going to define culture in a way that's actionable and practical, we've got to get very definition specific around what your culture is. And so some key questions that you can be thinking about to help define what your culture actually is if we talked to your customers, and if you talk to your customers and you ask them, what are the things that make us distinct or unique from our competitors? The things that they say in response to that question are elements of your culture, right? And so if we go back to the Publix versus Walmart example, if we went and polled customers and we said, what would you say are some of the differences, the reasons that you come to Publix versus Walmart or Walmart versus Publix or vice versa, you might hear customers say, well, at Publix, when I ask somebody where something is, they walk me to where that is in the store and they point it out on the shelf and they say, is there anything else I can help you with? That's part of their culture. At Walmart, when I ask where something is, they say, okay, it's in this part of the store. You're going to look for this aisle. There's going to be a big banner above it that says electronics. And the customers go to those stores in part because they identify with that experience, right? A lot of folks who enjoy Publix like that hands-on personal touch feeling. A lot of the customers who enjoy Walmart want to get in, find their stuff, get out, and they want it to be a very transactional, efficient, quick experience, right? And so those things that distinguish you from your competitors are a critical element of your culture, right? So if we're trying to define what culture is, that's certainly one thing to focus on. A few other things, if we kind of hovered in a drone above one of your stores or one of your operations or your shops or your call centers, and from that drone, we observed your employee population, what are the things that we would consistently see them doing? How do they interact with one another? How do they interact with their customers? How do they respond to problems and challenges and pressure and stress, right? Those behavioral tendencies of your employees are also a key element of your culture. Another way to attack this culture question is, what are the things that our top performers do that our lower performers don't do, right? And so I'm a very visual person. And so the way that I like to think about it is, imagine you have two giant buckets. Like, I always think of like the orange Home Depot 5-gallon bucket, but like enormous. And in one bucket, you've got all of your folks who are exceptional. And in the other bucket, you've got all of your folks who aren't that. So if we're looking down into those buckets, what are the things that you can articulate that distinguish the folks in the exceptional bucket from the folks who aren't in that bucket? And those things are elements of your culture. And then finally, what are the values and tendencies that are common across departments within your organization? So if I walk into your payroll group and then I walk into your sales group, two very different job families with classically very different work styles, what are the things that would feel common between them, where I would still know I was at your organization? And so these are key questions that help us start to bring our culture down to a practical level, right? And so we often recommend or employ surveys or focus groups. Focus groups are just a meeting conversation with an agenda. It sounds super fancy, but we're going to get together and have a conversation about our culture with the goal of articulating and defining what it is. Great. Now you got a focus group. But ultimately, you want to gather information and data around these 4 questions, and certainly potentially others, so that you can begin to articulate and define what your culture is. And I apologize for the length and setup here. I don't want to lecture at you, but there's a lot to unpack. And this is a very conceptual topic that we're trying to make not conceptual. So we go through our surveys, we collect information, we go through our focus groups and hear from leaders and employees and even customers potentially about the things that make us unique and distinct as an organization. So now we've got this framework, right? We are these things, these values, these competencies or qualities. So now what do we do with those? Now we, again, back to the word, behavioralize them, right? So our customers said we are gritty. Like we show up and we follow through. Okay, what does that mean? What does it look like when one of our employees is gritty? Well, they're resilient and they bounce back from mistakes. Whenever something goes wrong, they don't stew on it. Whenever we give them feedback or coaching, they're not sensitive about it. They take it in stride and they implement it and they apply it. And they pursue challenges directly as opposed to shying away from them. So they're confident, they're self-assured. They don't feel naturally apprehensive about the unknown. Those are the desirable behaviors associated with grit. And there are always 2 sides to every coin, right? So what does it look like when someone lacks that, right? And so for whatever your values are, we need to take the step to drill down into what does it mean when someone has this thing? What does it look like when someone demonstrates this value versus what does it look like when one of our employees struggles to demonstrate this value, right? And we want to get very specific. And in some cases, it can be beneficial to chop this out by job family or by role, right? So this is a framework of how this would work. But you can imagine that grittiness in a payroll department might look slightly different from grittiness in a sales department. And so those sorts of behavioral tendencies are important to note, right? We want to define what that value or that cultural characteristic is. So in working down through our framework, our funnel, right, we start conceptual. We want to gather information. We want to document that information. We want to organize our values and we want to define them. Our organization is this. And then we want to behavioralize them, right? Again, we want to link behaviors to those values. And this is so interesting. I have 4 young kids, right? And so Chick-fil-A is like a multiple times weekly occurrence for us. I have no idea what Chick-fil-A's stated values are. Couldn't tell you. Like I looked them up yesterday and I've already forgotten them. But I can define their culture for you because I experience it. I've seen the behavior. They operate with urgency and friendliness. They're extremely friendly, pleasant. And because they want to be extremely friendly and pleasant, they have a bigger staff. So they can still operate with efficiency and urgency, right? And so for them, going through and defining that culture and allowing that culture to inform some of their organizational operating style allows that culture to be very apparent to their customers. I think most of us, if we walked into our favorite establishment with a blindfold on and we couldn't see their branding and we didn't know geographically where we were, like Sarah mentioned earlier, we could feel their culture, and the things that we would feel are the behaviors of their employees, right? And so this drilling cultural values down to behaviors is so critically important. Okay, so we've done the work, we've got our values, we've behavioralized them, so to speak. Now, what do we do with those? How do we know that we're right? Ultimately, if you're on the right track, then the things that you see in your high performers should be the same things that you've defined out in your cultural framework. And so if we go and observe Taylor in customer success, and we've lined out our cultural values, we should see Taylor exhibiting those behaviors and those behaviors being responsible for driving her high performance, right? And so we want to go through the exercise of mapping those employee behaviors back to our cultural framework that we built. And so now we've gone through a systematic, rigorous process of defining those cultural characteristics or competencies. And now we can internally champion that, hey, these things are the reasons that a lot of our top performers are top performers. Now, there's a whole field of psychology, I-O psychology, a segment of that field that specializes in this sort of thing, right? Taking the conceptual framework of a culture and boiling it down to behaviors. And so, you're never alone in this sort of thing. There are always partners and vendors. Most assessment companies, the good reputable ones, are going to have I-Os on staff to support with this sort of thing. But ultimately, the effectiveness of a cultural framework hinges upon it being connected to the employees who are successful in the organization. So if we've gone through the exercise of defining those behaviors and linking them to employee performance, there are some benefits associated with that. Right. And some of these are ones that came from our research. There are certainly others from the academic literature. They're more engaged. They're less likely to turn over early. They're at less risk of burnout. Right. And so these are measurable benefits of hiring for culture. And we're about to get into how you actually do that here in just a moment. I remember I had a professor in graduate school who used to say, if you can't measure it, it's not real. And culture has been kind of in that conceptual land for a really long time, which is everybody says it's important. We have one, but they don't know how to measure it. And so if you can't measure it, it's not real. This is where the measurement really comes into play. Okay. So setting the stage for how we assess for these things, right? This is about hiring for culture fit. So how do we do that? If we go back, I'm going to scan back in our slides here for just a moment because I want a visual aid. Okay. So we go through, we define our cultural qualities, we associate behaviors with them. I-O psychologists in the hiring and selection space are specialists in linking behaviors to assessments, right? Whether those are personality, behavioral style assessments or aptitude assessments, you have partners available to help you with this, right? And so this is not a high match agenda. This is, hey, contact someone who's an expert, work with them through the process that you went through to define your behavioral characteristics of your culture, present it to them, and then there are people who will expertly help you map those behaviors onto assessments that are designed to measure those behaviors. So if we know collaboration is important, let's measure someone's tendency to be collaborative. If we know grit is important, let's measure someone's sense of urgency or their persistence or their initiative. And if we know that innovation is important, then we need to find assessment content that measures creative thinking or idea orientation, right? And so whenever you get to this stage where you've defined your behaviors and you've linked them to the way that your employees perform the job, the next step is to work through a mapping exercise where you take these behaviors and link them to specific assessment measures or traits or qualities that you can use to evaluate before you hire someone, is this person likely to be a good fit at our organization? And so if this was our cultural framework, what we're looking for are folks who are collaborative and gritty and predispositioned to creative, innovative thinking, developing ideas, as opposed to being conventional. So let me jump back to where we were, right? Skip one slide ahead too far. I apologize for that. So once we've mapped our cultural characteristics onto assessment content, now we can deliver that assessment to our employees. And we can make this super scientific and statistically fun for nerds like me, which is what we would expect to see is that our higher performers, the ones that we would quantify and classify as our best fitting employees, are the ones who are scoring higher on collaboration and grittiness and innovative thinking. And the other benefit is now we can answer the question with data. What's more important? Is it more important that they're collaborative? Is it more important that they're innovative? We can look at our high performers, evaluate how they score on our validated assessment, and we can answer that question. And so now we can build metrics and systems to quantify and classify what good fit looks like. So I'm going to pause there for a second because I think that's such an important concept. Ultimately, if you want to measure cultural fit, it depends upon you taking your cultural values and mapping them to an objective way of evaluating whether someone possesses those tendencies, values, personality qualities, whatever label we want to put on it. And once you've done that and you've evaluated your top performers via an assessment tool, now you can deliver that assessment to candidates with confidence that the candidates who score high on the measures that my high performers scored high on are the candidates who are likely to be a good fit in our culture. And you've stepped through kind of a scientific process to define out what that is. And so now, whenever you deliver that assessment, excuse me, I'm going to back up in a moment. Whenever you deliver that assessment, you get tangible data back on someone's goodness of fit across your different cultural values, right? And so in the case of Adrian here, our recruiting teams and hiring teams might want to ask questions about how focused Adrian tends to be on delivering results. Do they like urgency? Do we need to ask some questions about that? Do they like persistence? Do they like personal initiative? And so a tool like this one can be a very valuable resource for your hiring teams in evaluating goodness of fit. And so now when your executives come and say, hey, are we hiring employees who are a good fit for our organization? We can answer that objectively, right? We have data around that. We can measure it. Now culture is something real because it's measurable. And so we can evaluate, where do we have gaps, right? We know that delivering results is important. We also know that our current workforce lacks urgency and persistence, right? And so we can use these data points in a lot of really effective different ways for hiring and talent management. So I want to make one more point before we, kind of close and move towards kind of the Q&A section. And I kind of went about these out of order, so I'm sure our marketing folks are rolling their eyes at me right now, but they'll just have to, they'll be okay with it.
You're getting a slap on the wrist for sure.
I know, I did for sure. So one of the things that's always important to keep in mind about hiring and selection in certain jobs is that oftentimes culture is important, but incomplete. So if you're working in a startup environment and you've got a lot of pace and urgency and entrepreneurship and energy and enthusiasm, those are cultural elements that probably cut across every department in your organization. But if your tax accountant is innovative and collaborative, and that's all you're measuring, and you're not measuring their predisposition to be detail-oriented and process-minded and careful, you're probably missing some things that are important for them to be successful in the job, right? And so we know that cultural characteristics and competencies cut across departments, but oftentimes there are other knowledges, skills, and abilities and other characteristics, KSAOs, that are relevant for someone to be successful in a role. And so just want to make sure that we're presenting this with the caveat that culture is often important and central to effective hiring decisions, but it's not exhaustive in and of itself. If you're hiring someone to work in a call center where they're working at a terminal that has multiple monitors and a timer counting down, and they're dragging and dropping and taking notes, you probably want to measure their computer literacy at some level to ensure that even if they're a good cultural fit, that they're also a good skills fit for that position. And so it's always an important call out that cultural fit is important and central, but often it's not complete or exhaustive. We know that there are other traits and qualities and competencies that are relevant. And so just as a matter of review, and then I promise we're going to jump down to this stage and I'll pass it back to Sarah. But I know that was a lot of content. And so I want to go back to where we started here. If you're looking for something, to screenshot or to capture here, and we'll share, this framework with you. But if you're looking for something to take away, to bring a practical element to the way your organization does culture, this is what I would want you to take away. Is you've got to start with a method to define what your culture is. And that is always about your customers' perceptions of you, your employees' behavioral tendencies, and the things that distinguish your best performers from the folks who are not that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't adjustments and additions that you want to make to your culture, but we always want to start with where we are now. Once we've defined that, we've got to, I'm going to use the word again, behavioralize those. We've got to attach behaviors to those stated cultural competencies and values. So what does it mean for someone to be this, to be nimble, or to be adaptable, or to be resilient and take ownership, right? Whatever those values are, we've got to describe the behaviors that are attached to those values so that when we go out and we try to find a tool that's helpful, that tool can then be mapped onto those behaviors. And that's what allows us to do this final step of reaffirming that profile, validating it with our internal employee population, and then deploying it for candidates to take, right? Following this process ensures that you haven't made assumptions about what your culture is and isn't, that you can define using data and information that you've gathered. You can define why your culture is, why you're measuring the things that you're measuring. And then it also allows you to very objectively assess where are we great in terms of our cultural values that we're trying to achieve? Where does our employee population have gaps? So this is our framework. Okay, I'm going to skip way ahead through a bunch of slides that we've already seen, and then I'll pass it back to Sarah so that she can help wrap us up and get us to the Q&A portion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as the resident sales team representative, we have to get in our shameless plug, but just want to share that, Craig obviously represents our I-O team. My goodness, I didn't take enough sips of coffee. And everything that he talked about today is a very standardized process, right, that we are implementing with a ton of clients, some of which you're looking at down below. I'll throw marketing under the bus a little bit. There are some very large logos down there, and we certainly want you to be able to identify with them. A lot of the business that we work with is in the mid-market. We have a ton of small business clients. So this certainly isn't something that we're only implementing with large customers. But our entire approach of personalized assessments does exactly what Craig talked about, right? It's let's work with our clients, let's partner with them to really understand their organization, their culture. We want to do that first step really well, to where we say, give us those top performers, walk us through your values and tell us how that plays out. When they get a customer that's frustrated, what do you want someone to do? How do they handle that today? So we're having these really great conversations with our customers to really get to know their culture and help them to define it further. And that way we can start to build an assessment strategy that then works to gather those insights from candidates via a mobile assessment. So there's a lot of ways that we can do that. Some individuals want to really screen out those that aren't a good culture fit at the top. That same screen concept, we work with some of our clients to screen in, if you will. They don't really have a set profile. Some of those entry-level roles where the backgrounds can be vast. And so it's really about training the right individuals that are a good culture fit. We can certainly help with assessments and interviewing. There's a ton of products that we have out there, but I think the main point here is whatever insights you're looking to gather from candidates, whether that's the culture that Craig talked about, or the role specific traits that you might need insights on, we've certainly got the ability to help if you're interested.
Oh, and I'll steal this one.
That's right, Craig, it's you.
Well, again, would love to talk with you about where you're at in your culture journey, and the things that you're trying to accomplish in the culture realm or hiring and talent management realm in general. So you can use this card, or excuse me, this QR code to grab some time on our calendar, our I-O team's calendar. There won't be a sales agenda. We're not going to try to peddle a timeshare or anything like that. We really just want to nerd out and catch up on the experiences that you're having. That's right. Yeah, we won't invite Sarah for that one. on the experiences that you're having with this culture, oftentimes challenge that organizations are having in their hiring and talent management processes. So, what even we'll offer you a chance to take one of our assessments and gather some data around maybe the way that you approach work to some degree. So, would love for you to join us and grab some time. And if you are at a point where you're looking for a partner to work through that culture journey with you and start to define out how do we measure these things and deliver assessments to our employees, then Sarah's QR code down there is much smaller. But that doesn't mean that she's any less knowledgeable or valuable a resource on this topic. So if you're ready to talk more about how we can partner, then certainly Sarah and her team are available to chat about that. So want to leave some time here at the end. I'm very proud of us, Sarah. We finished 7 minutes, a whole 7 minutes ahead of time. And that gives us 7 minutes to respond to any questions that you might have. So for those of you who don't have questions, say it again.
Sorry, let's leave it on the other slide. And that way they can scan away. No, this is perfect.
Thank you. So if you don't have questions or don't want to stick around for Q&A, that's all the content that we have planned to share today. Would love to continue the conversation with you via one of these QR codes. But if you do have questions, more than happy to answer them or talk through them in a more private setting. Completely up to you. So we'll hang around for another 5-7 minutes or so.
Yeah. I do want to call out while we wait for questions that that free demo that Craig offered. Absolutely happy to. And I want to say, I say the free demo, the free assessment is a really cool spotlight assessment that would be representative of what you might get if you build a culture assessment with us. So it's a really unique one. If you're interested in trying to take that, I promise that we won't guard that free trial with a sales rep meeting either. So even if you're jumping on with Craig's team, it's really interesting to take that ahead of time and talk through your own results with him or a member of his team. So definitely happy to share that. And I want to say, I'm making sure that we're following. I know there's a link in the chat as well that Michael put if a link works better than the QR code for you. But it looks like we have a question. Craig, if I'll read it out loud while you read it and process so that everyone knows. We got a question that's asking, how do DEI initiatives fit into your assessments? So this is a self-proclaimed I-O nerd. I did not say that, that's in the question. So as an I-O nerd, I know that sometimes prioritizing culture fit might lead to a more similar workforce. I know you said it's only one part of a candidate.
That is such a good question.
Curious on your thought. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, that's why it's so important to take a very objective approach to defining what your culture is, right? And so I'm going to go back to the Chick-fil-A example, not because it's the only example, because I think it's a helpful one. A pleasant, friendly, approachable demeanor is gender agnostic. It's race agnostic. It's not that core quality is not something that is going to lead to a overly homogenous, uniform workforce. And so the reason that we want to take the steps to be very careful about defining out those cultural qualities and linking them to employee behaviors is that oftentimes the homogenous workforce culture is a result of people not being objective about what their culture is and what it isn't. And so executives say, hey, hiring managers hire for culture fit. And what they hear is, okay, I fit here. I just need to go hire people who look and think like me. And that's their concept of what good cultural fit is. And so this objective methodology of being very rigorous about defining what our culture is and also what it isn't is one of the best safeguards against poor DE&I practices in hiring, because you're taking a lot of the assumptions about what's important out of it, and you're defining very practically what your culture is, right? And so certainly we want to look for behavioral tendencies that are, again, gender and race and age agnostic, so that we're not setting ourselves up for an overly homogenous workforce. Diversity is so valuable, diversity of experiences, diversity of thought, diversity in terms of ideas and creativity. All of those things are critically important. And so we want that diversity. And one of the best ways to limit the risk of overly homogenous workforces is to not leave it up to subjective opinion about what culture is, because it's that subjectivity. And again, I want to be careful here. I don't want to overtalk. And so I know people are probably rolling their eyes. It's so interesting when you talk with someone who's interviewed a candidate and they say, yeah, I want to hire this person. They were a good fit. And then you ask them, well, what do you mean by that? They often have a really hard time articulating what they mean by good fit. And we're hardwired to prefer people who think and look and talk like us. That's not them being like, non-DEI minded. It's just that's how we're hardwired. And so bringing in these objective metrics to take the place of some of those objective evaluations is a critical step towards championing DE&I initiatives as opposed to squelching them. And so that objective process can go a long way to ensuring that you are being objective and deliberate about the cultural characteristics that you're hiring for. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, I'll be your MC. So we got another question that just came in. How would this work for an international company with different cultures across different regions?
That's such a good question. And the reality is that often some of those intense geographical divides necessitate having different cultural standards and expectations in a lot of those different regions, right? And so if we look at, clients who have locations in Germany versus, the UK versus the United States versus South America, there are some clear differences even within the same organization on how those cultural values are presented in their workforce. And so, oftentimes there are different cultural characteristics that exist in different geographical regions, especially those that are international. So it's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see any other questions at the moment, but we're happy to answer them. I know we've been answering that at the Q&A. Definitely feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat, wherever you'd like to put them. Give everybody a couple more minutes. Think while they're thinking. We are lucky enough to be working on, never mind. I think we have, so Craig, another question for you. How would you recommend starting the conversation about defining your culture within an organization? So I'm going to assume this means it was, someone was not tasked with it, but they find enough value in talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation, oftentimes starts with the benefits of prioritizing cultural fit, right? And so I know Sarah and I shared, that's what I was going for, some data and information around the benefits of prioritizing culture as part of the hiring process. And so I think generally speaking, executives and organizational leaders want to believe in the value of pursuing an initiative before kicking off a given initiative. So I think starting with some of the benefits and opportunities associated with culture is a great spot to start. And then I also think hosting a focus group with key stakeholders or culture setters within the organization is an excellent way to kick off and start to understand, kind of the shape and framework of your given organization's culture. Right. The whole thing is about drilling down. And I know I use that terminology a lot, but in order to drill down, we've got to start high. Right. And so we want to start with maybe those key stakeholders who have been responsible for setting the culture, championing the culture within the organization, and then kind of drill down from there.
Absolutely. I know that was all the questions in the live chat. Where I was going was I think it's interesting to share, and Craig, you're obviously at the center of this to kind of talk through when we've been having a lot of these conversations, right? And we're having conversations with HR, HR individual contributors, HR leaders. We've certainly had executives that are reaching out and saying, we're looking for help hiring. And it's so interesting how consistently, and this is, in part how we really want to shape the initial conversation. We're asking just a very generalized, what's going on in the business that has you interested in, and of course, in assessments when they're coming to us, right? But what we're really looking to understand is what's going on in the business with hiring. And Craig, you can correct me if I'm wrong. As I'm sure you guys can imagine, we're hearing, we're having an issue with retention or turnover, whichever side of the coin that you represent with. We're looking for better quality candidates. We're hearing a lot of those similar conversations, and it often starts with a role that they have in mind, whether that's a high volume role that is just a continuous struggle to get really good individuals staying in, or it's one of your roles that's just all around more difficult to hire for. And so you're looking for help. It's so interesting how often culture becomes a part of that conversation, because at the end of the day, there's, when you're talking about retention, right, it's what we always get down to, right? It's a better quality so that you can retain them, right? Reducing turnover is so that we can have better retention. And we often find that whether it starts or ends, culture is definitely a central piece of that conversation. So I love that someone asked how you start the conversation, right? Even if you weren't tasked with it, it's such a critical piece. And we almost always end up including some elements of culture in the assessments that we're doing. It looks like, let's see. Oh, Craig, so we have an individual. So she has her master's degree, or forgive me, they have their master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. So while culture fit is important, I think some companies are going down a path of hiring people just like them, versus hiring for a skill set. Do you feel like the shift for culture fit may lead to discriminatory practices, especially if companies are not looking at behavior as culture? Oh, perfect.
Yes,
So I want to make sure.
Yeah, excellent. So great question. And yes, I think the key part of this process is that we're being very objective about what good fit means. And we're trying to take the subjectivity out of that. So organizations that get overly focused on this idea of I want people who are a good fit for our company, but they have no objective way to define what that means, are the ones who are at the highest risk of discriminatory hiring practices. Because like I mentioned, what often happens is those hiring managers are the ones who are tasked with cultural fit, and not because they're intentionally doing this or because they're uninformed, but without objective metrics. When people think of good fit, what they think just intuitively is I need to find people who look like me and think like me and behave like me and who enjoy golf because I enjoy golf and who enjoy college football because I enjoy college football. And so if we're not very direct and clear about what we mean when we say cultural fit, and we don't go through that framework process of defining it and linking it to specific behaviors and showing that those behaviors are related to success, organizational success, goodness of fit metrics. If we don't work through that process and we just stop with, let's hire people who are a good fit, the natural end of that conversation is, okay, so you mean we need to hire more people who look and think like us. And that's really the opposite of what good fit means. What good fit means is we need to hire people who do the things that are effective and successful. And oftentimes those things are gender agnostic, race agnostic, age agnostic, as long as we're very direct and clear about defining what those things are. So it's a great question, and it's something that we're very sensitive to. It's why we're always focused on, if you want to measure culture, this is the framework that we need to step through. Because otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where we're hiring people who are a good fit, and the primary mechanism that we're using to evaluate that is, do they think like me? Do they talk like me? Do they look like me? Do they care about the things that I care about? And oftentimes those are not objective metrics of fit quality. So it's a fantastic question.
Craig is obviously not passionate about it at all. No.
Not at all.
That's awesome. Perfect. Well, we appreciate everyone's time. I know we've gone a little bit over. We're so appreciative of you asking questions and engaging with us today. It was wonderful to have everyone join. Friendly reminder that I will wrangle the sales team away from any sort of chat. No, I'm kidding, but friendly reminder that you can use the QR code here, or there's a link in the chat to book just a really informal conversation with Craig and or a member of his I-O team. They're happy to send you an invite to try our spotlight assessment ahead of that if you're interested. But we would love the opportunity to connect with you and talk about, your culture and your journey with trying to hire individuals that are a better fit within that. So we will leave it at that. We will take a little bit of extra time, but hopefully we'll see you on one of the next series of our webinar. I know marketing will be hard at work to get you some good follow-ups after this. But we hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and a great weekend. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.